Thank you for showing up at the Trade and Economic Development Unit's National Conversation session. We have been using these sessions as a platform to encourage conversation. For this evening's session, we are continuing the conversation on foreign exchange flows and woes. And our session chair this evening is Mr. Vivek Charan. Before I hand over to him, I would like to let you know and remind you that the sessions are being live streamed on YouTube, and I will share the link in the group chat shortly. In addition to which, I want to encourage you to put your mic on mute unless otherwise asked to, where we ask questions or we comment or we interact with the experts on the panel. So without further ado, I want to hand over to Mr. Charan, who will take us through the presentations for this evening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Vivek Charan. I'm the chairman of the Confederation of Regional Business Chambers. I'm very happy to chair this particular session, one of many that has been ongoing. Tonight in particular, I'd like to welcome our speakers, Dr. Terence Farrell, Mr. Michael Aniset, Dr. Roger Hussain, and Ms. Rebecca Gookool. I'd like to say that this evening is quite special, ladies and gentlemen, because we have with us speakers that have a great wealth of experience, and they bring with them a real perspective to where we actually are and to some of the issues that we're discussing tonight. The program for tonight is quite a simple one. We'd have Dr. Terence Farrell, followed by Mr. Michael Aniset, then Dr. Roger Hussain, then followed by Rebecca, after which we will have a discussion, questions, and so on. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Terence Farrell. I'm sure Dr. Terence Farrell is known to many as a Caribbean or Trinidad intellectual. He's a former central bank deputy governor. He's worked in the private sector for many regional companies, particularly information, tech, insurance, and media. He's also a certified mediator, fellow of the Institute of Banking and Finance, and a member of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute. He has also been appointed to several government committees over time, over the years, which have addressed various public policy issues. Most recently, he was on the Economic Development Advisory Board and the National Tripartite Advisory Council, let's say 2016, 2017. Dr. Farrell is also an author of some nonfiction works, 3 books in particular: The Underachieving Society, The Cultural Roots of Economic Underdevelopment, and the Caribbean Monetary Integration. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Dr. Terence Farrell and his presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vivek, and good evening to everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here again at the Trade and Economic Development Unit, talking about this question of foreign exchange. It's obviously it's a topic which, as characterized by the organizers of FOREX flows and woes, meaning that there are a lot of people who are obviously unhappy with the current foreign exchange situation. I think particularly those people who find it difficult to get foreign exchange. And anytime I talk to anybody anywhere and so on, that issue comes up, that people talk about the difficulty that they have in terms of accessing foreign exchange. So what I wanted to do with my presentation essentially is basically using some graphic slides, is to try to explain what has been going on, where we are in terms of our foreign exchange situation, and then talk a little bit about what the outlook is going to be over the course of the medium term, that's over the course of the next 2, 3, 4 years. I just want to say that the metric that we typically talk about when we're looking at the whole foreign exchange situation is the country's foreign exchange reserves. Now, the foreign exchange reserves number, which we'll see in a second when we put up the chart, is a very important number. But what that number does is that it kind of reflects or it encapsulates all of the transactions which are taking place between Trinidad and Tobago and the rest of the world. So in other words, it's the outcome of a number of things taking place on what we call the current account as well as the capital account. In other words, imports, exports, imports of goods, imports of services, capital transactions, portfolio transactions, purchases of shares, and so on. And so the reserves number sort of summarizes where the country is at. And if you look at the charts, the first chart, I think on the left, is really the longer chart, and that's significant because taking you back to say 2008, 2009, compared to where we are today in December of 2023, you would see that we are in fact in a position in terms of the quantum of foreign exchange reserves. There has been a steady decline in the foreign exchange reserves since December of 2014, when we kind of peaked. But the figures that we have today are in fact even lower than what we had towards the period 2005 coming up to 2010. So what we have is that we have decline in the foreign exchange reserves, which is summarizing or encapsulating the fact that the country has been running essentially persistent balance of payments deficits over that period of time. Now, there are a couple of things. One is that if you look at the chart on the right, there are a couple of you'll see as we begin to decline from around 2014, there are a couple of periods where the chart jumps, right? And in my original presentation, I had kind of indicated what those were. Essentially, what those were, one, we had in around 2016, we had a significant amount of external borrowing. I think we borrowed about $1 billion US, as well as we have had some HSF drawdowns. I think particularly in the period around COVID, we drew down a significant amount out of the Heritage and Civilization Fund. So the Heritage and Civilization Fund are not part of the country's official foreign exchange reserves, may I put it that way. The official foreign exchange reserves are held by the central bank, and essentially they are reflecting what is on the balance sheet of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. The HSF is a separate fund. It is managed by a committee, which includes actually folks from the central bank, but the HSF is not counted for normal purposes as part of the country's foreign exchange reserves. However, I would point out that as far as the lenders to Trinidad and Tobago are concerned, external lenders to Trinidad and Tobago are concerned, they do count or they do take into consideration the Heritage and Civilization Fund balance in terms of they're assessing whether or not they would be lending to Trinidad and Tobago. In other words, our external borrowing is supported by the country's Heritage and Civilization Fund, which currently is in the region of about $5.5 billion US. The foreign exchange reserves at the end of December 2023 were around 6.3 billion US dollars. There's another sum of money. I don't know call it reserves because they are not part of the country's reserves, but they are significant, and it's another number that a lot of people know or look at, and it's actually the foreign currency deposits in the local banking system. Okay, that number has risen fairly steadily since we liberalized in 1993, and no, that's not the number, Rebecca. That's it. That number has risen and now stands at about 4 billion. Now, what those foreign currency deposits in the commercial banks are, they are deposits of Trinidad and Tobago companies and individuals, and mostly companies, Some of those companies which, excuse me, which have those, hold those deposits, $4 billion US currently, are in fact state enterprises. They are state enterprises or statutory boards. Now, I'm guessing that because the central bank does not tell you who are the owners of the foreign currency deposits. But based on information which one can glean otherwise, it is because they do break it down into individual holdings and companies and so on. I suspect that a significant part of that $4 billion of foreign currency deposits are in fact held by entities which are state entities, i.e. they are either state enterprises or statutory boards, or they may be entities like the National Insurance Board. Now, if that is the case, and if I am right about that, then although those sums are not part of the country's official foreign exchange reserves, if you do have a crisis, as for example, when we had the IMF programs back in the 1980s, we did in fact at the central bank, and this was not encouraged by the IMF at the time. We did in fact access foreign exchange holdings from state enterprise and statutory bodies, and we would put them into the central bank in order to make sure that we pass the IMF test. The point being that in an extreme situation, the government would probably be able to put their hands on those foreign currency deposits, which are owned by statutory bodies or state enterprises. So we have, if you like, we have three buckets of foreign exchange reserves. We have the official reserves, which are currently about 6.3 billion, but have come down significantly over the course of the last 8 years or so. We have the HSF, which is about 5.5 billion currently. And then we have some amount of I don't want to call them reserves, we have some amount of foreign currency deposits, which in an extreme situation, the government could potentially access. The point I'm making here is that the foreign exchange situation is not dire. It is not, we're not by any means in the crisis. And I know that some economists have over the course of the last couple of years and so on, have talked about the country running out of foreign exchange reserves and so on. That was, in my view, never on the cards. So how do we explain then the fact that people complain that they have little access to foreign exchange? Okay, and then we can go to the next slide, Rebecca. Yeah. And so I haven't used a slide. These are the numbers. And these numbers are interesting because these are the actual cash flows into and out of the commercial banking system. That is to say, the commercial banks are the authorized dealers for foreign exchange. The first column, which are sales of foreign currency to the public, is what the commercial banks sell to us, sell to companies, sell to businesses on a daily basis, on a monthly basis, on an annual basis, in order to meet their foreign exchange needs. And when you look at those numbers, you see that the numbers have in fact dropped fairly significantly from around 6.77 billion. These are US dollars, by the way, right? We're always talking US dollars. Down to currently about 6.2, $6.5 billion. We had a very low period, 4.5 billion, 4.9 billion, 2021, which is really the COVID period when the economy was basically locked down. So that first column is reflecting the sales of foreign exchange by the commercial banks, by the authorized dealers to the public. The second column are the purchases of foreign currency from the public. Now, the truth is that those purchases are really from a few companies. They are from companies like Heritage, or formerly Petrotrin. There are companies like the petrochemical companies who remit foreign exchange in order to be able to pay their taxes or to pay their workers and so on. And there are a couple of other companies. So it is not the case that there are significant inflows of foreign exchange coming from the man in the street, so to speak. Or the manufacturing companies which are earning foreign exchange, which are net earners of foreign exchange. Some of them may bring some money back, but it's not going to be a significant amount. Those amounts that we are seeing there, those numbers, are essentially reflecting companies like the petrochemical companies, like Heritage Petroleum, which is a net earner of foreign exchange. Now you'll see that the sales number, what the commercial banks, authorized dealers sell to us, and what they buy from the public, there's a big gap between the two. Okay, and so therefore, what that is telling us is that the demand for foreign exchange is exceeding the supply. Now, the reason for that is that because there is another supply that is going on, and that supply goes not to the commercial banks, but it goes directly to the central bank. And that's an arrangement that we have had since the late 60s, early 1970s, actually, where we made an arrangement with the upstream companies in oil and gas that they would pay, although they are not obligated by law to do that, but they would pay their taxes, that is their royalties, SPT, PPT, all of the things that they pay, their unemployment zone, they would pay that in US dollars to the government through the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. So those funds go to the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. The Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago credits the government of Trinidad and Tobago with the TT dollar equivalent of that, which goes into the government's cover into the consolidated fund. And the central bank then becomes the holder of those that flow of foreign exchange. The central bank also would get other inflows of foreign exchange. For example, when the government borrows externally, it does an external borrowing, they borrow from CAF or they borrow from the commercial markets or something, those flows go directly to the central bank. The central bank credits the government of Trinidad and Tobago with the TT dollar equivalent. So the central bank has a pool of foreign exchange. So in the commercial banks are selling foreign exchange to the public. The public is selling foreign exchange to the commercial banks, but there is a gap, there's a deficit, and that deficit is made up by the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. Now, again, if you look at the numbers there, it's very clear to see that the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, in times past, going back to say 2014, 2015, would simply provide whatever the commercial banks asked for. Whatever the deficit was, the Central Bank would supply that. So you see, for example, in 2015, that was amounted to about $2.6 billion. Now, as the country's foreign exchange situation became tighter, when prices fell, and we'll talk about that in a second, when oil and gas prices began to fall after 2014, 2015, the way in which the government has dealt with the foreign exchange market situation, since we no longer have exchange controls, the Exchange Control Act was essentially gutted in 1993 when we floated the exchange rate. The way in which the situation is now managed is that it is managed by the central bank limiting the amount of funds that it provides to the commercial banks to make up that deficit, okay? So what that then does is that it puts the commercial banks in the position where they are effectively rationing foreign exchange on behalf of the central bank, on behalf of the monetary authorities. So that essentially is how the system is currently working. There are no exchange controls as we used to have, where those controls were managed by the central bank directly. So that if some of you who are old enough would remember that in those bad old days of exchange control, that what used to happen is that you would apply to the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago if you wanted to buy foreign exchange, to do anything, just to go to university, to buy whatever, you would apply to the central bank. The central bank would make that approval, and then it would issue that approved form to the commercial bank, and the commercial bank would then be obligated to sell you, okay? And the central bank providing the foreign exchange to the commercial banks to enable that to happen. That no longer happens. So what is happening now is that since the demand for foreign exchange exceeds the supply, what is happening now is that the rationing that is taking place is being done by the commercial banks, right? And the basis is, well, on what basis are they doing that? I think, truth be told, that the basis on which the commercial banks do that now is on the basis of essentially relationships that they would have with their customers, so that if, for example, you are a Scotiabank customer and you walked into Republic Bank and said, I want foreign exchange, the Republic Bank will say, I'm not going to give you any, okay? So that's one way. It depends on the relationship that you have. And then even among their customers, the commercial banks would ration the foreign exchange available based on essentially their perception of the need of that particular business. Now that then does lead to a certain perception of inequity. We have heard all of the cries about small and medium enterprises saying we're not getting foreign exchange. And that has prompted the government now to create the Exim Bank window to try to give more foreign exchange to so-called manufacturing enterprises and so on. So we now have a mechanism for the allocation of foreign exchange, an informal mechanism through the Exim Bank and so on. But basically, what we have is a rationing because the commercial banks manage their foreign exchange situation by ensuring that on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis that they don't sell more foreign exchange than they have, okay? And so therefore, people walk into a commercial bank and say, I want X amount of US dollars. And at that point in time, the commercial bank may be in a situation, it might be in the middle of the month, it might be in a situation where the central bank has not yet supplied the commercial banks with funding, and the commercial bank will say, sorry, I don't have any foreign exchange, come back next week, come back next month. The other consideration I think that's important for people to understand has to do with the question of cash, okay? Because a lot of people say, well, they want to go into the commercial bank and they would want to get $200 US, they want to get $300 US, they want to get $500 US, and they want to get that in notes, in notes issued by Uncle Sam. The problem is that physical notes, physical US dollar notes are very scarce. The commercial banks can't manufacture them. The commercial banks depend on people coming into the commercial bank and selling them those US dollar notes. They may have traveled abroad, they come back, they want to get TT dollars to sell that amount of US dollars to the commercial banks. And so therefore, that's what the commercial banks have. And the commercial banks, in terms of being able to sell foreign exchange to somebody who walks in off the street, or even one of their customers who wants US dollar cash on any particular week, on any particular day, the commercial bank simply may not have that cash available to it. Most transactions today, 99% of transactions today take place on the basis of wire transfers of deposit to deposit account to deposit account. Your account in Trinidad to an account in New York, and that's how the correspondent banks get involved. So that the actual holding of those deposits are typically not in Trinidad. They are held in the correspondent banks in New York, in London, in probably in a couple of other European countries, and that's about it. So when people complain and they say they can't get cash, they can't get US dollar cash, the reason is that the commercial banks simply don't have it, and therefore they can't sell you what they don't have. Okay. So let's step back a little bit then and say, okay, well then what has caused this decline in our foreign exchange reserves? Because we have a situation where demand is exceeding supply. And as demand is exceeding supply, what then happens is that the foreign exchange reserves decline. Foreign exchange reserves decline consistently. It gets bumped up a little bit by foreign borrowing. It gets bumped up a little bit by drawdowns from the HSF as we've had. But basically, the trend is in a downward trend. It's falling. That's very clear from the numbers. So what is causing that? So if you go to the next chart, right, the basic fundamental explanation for what is going on is summarized in what is happening in respect of where does the foreign exchange come from. The foreign exchange essentially comes from the energy sector. It comes from not so much even from oil, or from heritage. Heritage does generate some foreign exchange, but it comes from the upstream producers. It comes from the BHPs or Woodside. It comes from Shell. It comes from BP, and they are exporting the gas. The gas comes in. The gas goes out. They provide the tax revenues in US dollars to the government through the central bank. But our natural gas and crude oil production has been falling. And it has been falling, as you see from the chart, fairly consistently. So if you look at gas, because oil is quite frankly not an issue at this point in time, gas we have come down from being a 4 BCF per day economy to an economy where we are now about 2.7 BCF per day economy. So that's the extent of the decline that we've had. There are a bunch of reasons for that. We've had an energy conference this week where people have talked to, we've talked extensively about what is happening, and I'll show you a chart a little bit later on as to what the outlook is. But basically, what's been happening with Trinidad is that production has been falling, natural gas production has been falling. Oil prices gas prices jumped in 2022 as a result of the war in Ukraine, right? So, excuse me, if you go to the next chart, and the next chart is hopefully the prices chart, right? The prices chart, you will see what has happened there. You see the sharp fall in natural gas prices across the board because there are different prices. We have Henry Hub, which we talk about all the time, which is the one at the bottom in orange. That's Henry Hub, that's the US price, but the more significant prices are the European prices and the Asian prices. And they started to fall off from 2014 as well. So, but we see that from 2022 with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that gas prices skyrocketed. Not only gas prices, but the prices of ammonia, methanol, the petrochemicals, production, that those prices also jumped significantly. Now, they've since come back down, although they have not come back down to the levels that we had, let's say in 2019, 2020. So oil prices are still in the 70s. Brent is still around 70-something. The prices of gas in Europe and in Asia, which are the significant markets in respect of gas exports, that those prices have come down from the spike due to the Ukraine war, but they have not come down to the levels that we saw back between the period 2015 to 2019. So production has been falling, prices had come down, right? And that impacted government's revenue to a significant degree. That led then to the fiscal deficits and so on that we've talked about in the past. We had that jump in 2022, and that supported government, the fiscal deficit. In fact, we had a fiscal surplus in 2022 as a result of price movements, not as a result of what has happened in respect of production. Now, I want to take us to the next chart. The next chart is a little bit, it's probably slightly complicated, and it really is the Dutch disease model, and I am quite sure that Roger is going to talk a lot more about this. But basically, one of the things that we want to note here about our economy is that when you keep, the government has kept the exchange rate, the nominal exchange rate. They have kept the nominal exchange rate essentially fixed over the course of the last 7-8 years. It hasn't changed. The real effective exchange rate, and we can ignore the effective part of our EER, the real effective. Effective simply means that we are fixed relative to the US dollar, but other countries' exchange rates move relative to the US dollar. So the euro changes relative to the US dollar, the yen changes relative to the US dollar. So when we look at the effective exchange rate, in other words, we weight our exchange rate by our trading with Europe, with Japan, with other countries and so on, and we look at how their exchange rates have moved, that gives you the effective exchange rate. The real effective exchange rate has to do with the fact that as we go forward, what happens is that although the nominal exchange rate is fixed, that is to say we had 679, whatever that number is, if If, and as usually is the case, Trinidad and Tobago's inflation rate is higher than the inflation rate of the United States or the inflation rate of our trading partners, then that difference, that differential actually causes your real effective exchange rate to appreciate. So one of the charts which we would have had would, which comes up from the IMF. So if you look at any one of the IMF publications, you will see that chart. And that is that it shows, and the IMF measures this, the central bank also measures it as well. I believe the central bank has a table that it publishes the effective exchange rate in. And you will see that there has been appreciation of the real effective exchange rate of Trinidad and Tobago over the course of the last 8-10 years. Now, what does that mean, right? What is that telling us? So it is something that we don't perceive it. We don't, all we see is 679 or 675 as the case may be. But we are not really understanding that in real terms, that the exchange rate has in fact become cheaper. Appreciation means that it is in fact cheaper for us to import things, right? The cost of importing is actually going down. Imports become relatively cheaper in relative terms. Economists are always concerned about relative prices, not about the actual nominal price. And so therefore, in relative terms, what is happening is that imports become cheaper. Now, as imports become cheaper, what then happens is that people therefore want the demand for foreign exchange is going to be sustained or is going to increase because imports in real terms is going to be cheaper. The second factor that we have has to do with government. Now, my concept of the Dutch model, which might be a little bit different from what we perhaps teach. I don't know what to teach economic students today, but certainly the models of people like Corden and other people and so on tend to focus on the changes in wages. Now that's fine. My point is, where does that come from? And in my view, where it comes from is that we have in our economy, government is large in the economy. Government is a significant, consumes a significant proportion of GDP. Government is a significant employer of labor in the country. Government is therefore taking the rents from the energy sector, and it is spending those rents. And what is it spending those rents on? What is it spending those energy sector revenues on? It is basically spending them, excuse me, on non-tradable goods. They're spending them on housing, on road infrastructure, on water, on whatever, which are basically non-tradables. In that process, what happens is that wages tend to rise in both nominal and in real terms. But what we have to be concerned about is then what then becomes the effect of that when we add in what I describe as rent-seeking behavior on the part of a significant part of a proportion of the country, both in labor and in the business community. Rent-seeking behavior. What happens is that it disincentivizes the production of tradables, i.e., the production of exports outside of the energy sector or the production of import substitutes. They become less competitive. And as a result of that, and I'm quite sure that Roger will produce his famous chart, which he likes to produce, what then happens is that we see in Trinidad and Tobago, the proportion of non-tradables to tradables is growing in the economy. And the economy is thereby becoming less competitive. So we hear all of the talk about diversification and the need for diversification and so on. But the point is that what we have is that we have an economy which is structured. The incentive structure in the economy is such as it works against diversification of the economy. It works towards the increased production of non-tradable goods and services. It works towards more rent-seeking type of behavior that we see in the economy. So the economy becomes less competitive over time. So, but this is a deliberate policy choice. The deliberate policy choice that the government has made, not only this government, previous governments, have made is that what we will do is that in order to keep prices down, we are going to keep the exchange rate fixed. And in keeping the exchange rate fixed, we will manage potential inflationary pressures. We will avoid any notion of exchange rate induced devaluation and hence price increases. And politically, that becomes more palatable for the economy. However, the point that we make is that that has certain other kinds of effects which disincentivize the production of tradables, which disincentivizes the diversification of the economy. So let's then turn to the last slide, which is really what the outlook is for, for the economy over the course of the next couple of years. So the first thing I want to say is about prices, right? If you ask me, well, what's going to happen to natural gas prices and crude oil prices over the course of the next 2 to 3 years, the answer is really, I don't know. And I don't think that very many people know. The best estimate of the price tomorrow is the price today. The price of Brent is around $70-something. The price for WTI is around $77. The price for European gas is what it is. The problem is that currently, in terms of the geopolitical environment, we have a lot of uncertainty. The Ukraine war has gone on for 2 years now. One would not have thought that. I certainly didn't think that it would have, but it's a war of attrition that is going on in Ukraine. We have the situation emerging in the Middle East, in Gaza, which is now having implications for the entire Middle East. I understand this afternoon an oil tanker was hit by one of the Houthi missiles. So there's a lot of uncertainty taking place. In that uncertainty, it is unlikely that, in my view, that gas prices and oil prices are going to fall from where they currently are. But whether or not they are going to spike again, the truth of the matter is that we really don't know. So the best assumption is the current prices, let's assume that those current prices remain roughly where they are over the course of the next couple of years. The key for us is the question of production. What is happening, not of oil production is neither here nor there. What is likely to happen in respect of natural gas production over the course of the next couple of years? Now, what do we know, right? Well, we know that if you do nothing, that production is going to decline. It's going to decline at a rate of 15, 20, sometimes 25% a year if you do nothing. So you've got to keep investing to keep just simply on the treadmill to keep production where it is. Our production has been declining. The reason for that go back to the period 2007, 2008, where certainly it is the case that the upstream companies were not sufficiently incentivized for additional exploration work. They basically stopped doing that. Gas production basically peaked. We went into decline. There was gas curtailment in the Polydesis estates for the petrochemical companies, which affected their production and continues to affect their production. As we look forward, we know that we are now trying to get Venezuelan gas from Dragon, and we're trying to get gas from the Laurel Manatee field. We also know that there is the Woodside's former BHP's Calypso field, which is in deep water. And I have put this together based on what I am told by people who know a lot better than I do, what is likely to happen in respect of the next couple of years. Now, one is that we are in 2024. What is interesting here is that 2024 will accommodate power production.
Can I call your father and tell him he have to open the gate because I can't call from here and he has my keys.
Yeah, somebody needs to mute. So we power production, petchem production, and possibly three LNG chains can be accommodated in 2024. In 2025, it looks as though we may not even be able to accommodate 3 trains of LNG. Train 1 is still down and probably likely to remain down for a while. I mean, we now have an integrated operation. But the point is that both petrochemicals and LNG will be operating. Capacity utilization will be lower over the course of the next couple of years. we know that the petrochemical companies are getting gas sales contracts, but those gas sale contracts are short-term. They are basically 2- and 3-year contracts, in 2 years in most cases. And that affects the ability of those companies to operate effectively. The reason being that you need, as an ammonia producer, methanol producer, every 3 or 4 years, you need to do a massive turnaround. That is to say, you need to invest somewhere between 40 and 60 million US dollars in turning the plant around. But if you have a short-term gas sales contract and you don't know what quantities, I'm not even talking about price yet, what quantities of gas you're going to get, it makes planning for the punt leases companies a little bit challenging. The other thing is that we expect from 2027 that we expect to see some maybe Laurel Manatee coming on. We expect that that Dragon may come on in 2027. The information I have is that Calypso is not likely to come on until about 2029, if it does, because the commercial terms for Woodside's Calypso coming on have not yet been determined, and therefore those reserves, which are about 3.2 trillion cubic feet of gas, those are the reserves which they say is out there. The commercial terms have not been settled, and therefore they will just simply sit out there until those are settled. So it certainly looks like in the period 2024 to 2026, 2027, we are going to continue to be challenged in respect of natural gas production. And if we assume that prices are going to be more or less where they are now, then that has implications for government revenue. I haven't taken the next step of saying, well, okay, what then happens to government fiscal operations over the course of the next couple of years? More than likely, we are going to go back into deficit over the course of the next couple of years. And in respect of foreign exchange availability, it certainly looks to me that we are going to continue to see the foreign exchange reserves decline as they have been doing slowly. Come back to my first point I made. The situation in respect of our foreign exchange reserves is not dire. It is not a crisis by any means, but I'd make the final point that the current incentive structure that we have in respect of the foreign exchange market and the exchange rate disincentivizes economic diversification, disincentivizes the production of tradable goods outside of the energy sector. So with that, Chairman, I'd want to stop, and hopefully that may prompt some questions from our audience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Farrell. As a matter of fact, while you were speaking, many questions were coming in. I thought that was quite interesting when you said, in particular that it's not dire, and then you went on to show, the purchases of Forex over the years. It was quite interesting to see, for example, that purchases from the public, which would be possibly those large companies, energy sector and so on, that actually earn Forex. And was said to us last year that it was because these the banks were unable to purchase the usual amounts from these companies that really set things in motion, that led to this perceived notion of a crisis, where the banks were saying, well, we need to cut credit card limits by 50%, and small and medium businesses were unable to get Forex as they were accustomed to. But another way of looking at it as well too is, while there's an understanding that it may not be on a crisis level, which you are correct, because if you walk into the supermarket, you're not seeing empty shelves, or you're not seeing a lack of diversity of products within even the same product range. So for example, you look at confectionaries, or you look at drinks, or meats and so on, there's a huge variety. So, and all of these things would be really, with our food import bill. And when we look at some of the graphs that you presented, and we, for example, take the food import bill in US dollars in Trinidad and Tobago, and we impose that upon those graphs as well, what we will actually see is, that our food import bill is increasing and increasing at quite a tremendous rate over the years, which means to say that there is a supply of US dollars to actually facilitate the purchase of this demand for food, imported food and so on, whatever it may be, into Trinidad and Tobago. There's also the issue that I learned recently that since COVID, the government has prioritized the supply of forex to certain uses. Before that, one of it was manufacturing, and then when COVID came, it was certain aspects of food, and then it was pharmaceuticals, and I believe certain aspects of toiletries, for example, things like soap, sanitary products, that sort of thing. So that may also be quite telling why in certain sectors they may not be feeling a shortage of forex, or they may not be feeling the pressures of a shortage of forex, while in other industries, for example, small and medium and so on, people who import to sell, that sort of thing, people who have franchises and so on, they may be feeling the pinch a bit more. It's also quite interesting to see, you're talking about that 4 billion that may be in reserves in commercial banks from state companies. And when you spoke about the foreign debt, and foreign debt really has been increasing. I mean, you spoke about it in 2016, it increased, but we know for a fact that it has been increasing. And maybe we can surmise that the greater level of foreign debt and the greater the demands upon the government revenue stream, in a sense, the forex revenue stream, to repay those loans over time, which obviously have to be repaid in forex. Given the fact that these forex revenue streams of the government that used to come in rent and other things like that, economic rent, are not what they used to be, and in fact possibly declining. And then we also looked at you mentioned that we may be looking at further deficit budgets going forward, and we're already in that. So the scenario I believe still remains the same, one of some concern, in that whereas we're not at that crisis level as yet, some aspects within our economy, particularly certain sectors, are feeling the pinch very much so, while others are not. But the fact is, what does the future imply for us moving forward? So thank you very much for that, Dr. Farrell. Right now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Aniset. He's also no stranger to us in Trinidad and Tobago, particularly to the newspapers and so on, makes news, quite often, as it were, and the media. Mr. Michael Aniset, he's President General of the Seamen and Waterfront Workers Trade Union, General Secretary of the National Trade Union Center, and the General Secretary of the Caribbean Congress of Labor, General Secretary of the National Trade Union Center. He's also the Vice Chair of International Transport Workers Federation for the Caribbean and Latin America, and is actively involved in trade union movement for 40 years, which we know, which gives them as well to a real perspective from this perspective of the from labor, the working man, the working woman, and how they actually are dealing with things like inflation in our economy, disposable income, wages, that sort of thing. He's also been appointed to several state boards, notably Trinidad and Tobago Mortgage Finance, National Insurance Board, and also the Cipriani Labor College. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome Mr. Michael Aniset.
Hey, Ola. Hello, are you hearing me?
Yes, Mr.
We're all hearing
Aniset,
you,
go
yes.
ahead.
Okay, all right. Pleasant good night to all and the distinguished members of the panel, and also the listening public and those who are tuned on live on YouTube. I think it's a great opportunity for the invite, and I wish to express my thanks to the body who thought it advisable to invite the labor to have a labor perspective on what we are talking about. And I would like to start our conversation in the context of what we experience within the trade union movement and the labor movement, and what workers are actually experiencing. And while I appreciate some of the statistics that has been expounded by my learned friend, Dr. Farrell, I wish to start off by saying, one, that market must not govern society. Market has been around for years, and therefore the social system that is constructed by society with a democratic regulatory system onshore and the offshore system must be looked at. And one might be asking why, because foreign exchange is important. We import 90% of our goods and services, and therefore the impact of FOREX, as you say, but foreign exchange, as we were saying, the labor movement is critical to the very economy that we are talking about. But from a trade union perspective, we see the economy in the context of people. We see the economy in the context of a people-centered run economy where the issues that are affecting the ordinary citizens, the average working class, must be critical. And I listen, quite frankly, in awe when I'm hearing that there are so many things in the grocery, and therefore the issue of foreign exchange is not an issue. But I think in the context of pluralism thinking, we need to ask ourselves a fundamental question. Is the goods and services that requires to be purchased, are we seeing that uptick in the purchase of those very goods and services that you are seeing in the groceries or in the stores? Are we looking at the amount of small business, medium-sized business are shutting their doors every day? And what are the implications for the economy? What are the implications for the whole society when we find ourselves in that particular situation? And I think I don't need to go into what Dr. Farrell would have said. He would have done a good job in grafting and showing all the graphs. But the reality to us is what happens to a worker? What happens to a worker in the context of this foreign exchange? Because one must remember that spending is a driver of any economy, because one person purchase is another person pay. And when we have those issues, and I will juxtapose now in the context of, let us really sit back as a people and ask ourselves the question, are we better off? Does it necessarily mean because we have all this money in the central bank and the heritage fund, which we would have borrowed, I'm quite aware of that, for the COVID and the other funds? Do we really translate that into what it means for the ordinary citizen? Are we aware of what is happening to the ordinary citizens in Trinidad and Tobago when we have that galloping cost of living? And some may talk about core inflation, some may talk about headline inflation, but the fact is that the value of the dollar cannot purchase and buy the goods and services that you would normally buy. So the issue of time value of money needs to be looked at in the context of the very same foreign exchange, because foreign exchange also speaks to the question of investments. All right, research and development. And the issue that Dr. Farid raised, I think is something that we have to examine in the context of pluralism thinking. Is it that a system within a government should be allowed to continue without getting the parties, whether it's academia, the intellectuals, the ordinary citizens, the stakeholders, in the context of what kind of society that we want? And I will want to raise something to my audience. The question of foreign exchange is almost frightening in the context of, I can go to Jamaica now and Barbados and get US money to buy. I can go to Antigua. And the question that we have to ask ourselves, what they are doing in Antigua, what they are doing in Jamaica, in Barbados, and in Guyana, that foreign exchange is accessible easily, but in Trinidad and Tobago, we have this limit of the purchase of the Forex rather. And I also raise the question, which has not been raised, and I will want to put it on the table, the question of the parallel economy to the real economy, which is running neck and neck with the real economy, which creates problems in Trinidad and Tobago. And it is amazing. It is amazing in the context of the other economy that foreign exchange is not an issue. And one has to ask themselves the question, what does that mean for Trinidad and Tobago? I think that is a critical question that must be asked, and we must raise those issues with the greatest of respect and put those issues on the table. I don't want to go into the history of what happened in the World War when they did the Bretton Woods exercise and what was done, what happened in the Greece crisis, what happened in the Europe, in the Asian tigers. But we have a lesson that is embedded in all those experience and all those historical data. And the question is, in my humble view, if we have a society, which we have in Trinidad and Tobago, and I want to make that particular point, that where the social needs of the people are structured in a way where everything is commodified, where privatization of commerce, which is eating up almost everything, that has no value in the context of Trinidad and Tobago, but only looks at the question of profits. What are the productive investments we are making in Trinidad and Tobago, which is critical in terms of any economy? Is our investment must only be aligned to that of the KFCs, the rituals, and all these other companies and businesses, which eats up foreign exchange. But what does it put back into the economy in the context of something productive that will help grow our foreign exchange and the ability for workers to buy the goods and services? I will want to submit my friends, and you all can guide me, we can have the debate that in the absence of having real wages, in the construct of where wages are depressed, where you get wage increases from 10 years after, from a government who is one of the biggest employers, as we are aware, that has an effect on any economy. And the issue that I raised in my opening remarks, where when I buy something and my salary, because when I go to the groceries, to the gas station, I am paying somebody, must be part of the process to bring about the equilibrium that we speak of, that is an economy. And an economy cannot be strictly on the basis of the so-called financialization of an economy where workers and the people are excluded. So those are some fundamental questions that I want to put on the table. And the issue is, when we have when we lose the capacity to subject the economy to other thinking, as a trade unionist, we have to raise those kinds of questions, because I believe we have a responsibility to put all the ideas and the concepts on the table and come up with a construct that is in the interest of Trinidad and Tobago. And therefore, we are saying, from a trade union perspective, the question of wage-led growth, the question of job-led growth has to be the underlying principles that governs your economy. Because in the absence of that, the question that we want to ask from a labor perspective is what kind of society that we want to build. The economy is changing. There is no doubt about it. With all the technology, all the AIs, and all the other technology, what we will want to call in the trade union movement, the cloud economy and the cloud financialization, which has all kinds of impact for Trinidad and Tobago. And we within the Caribbean region, as a small region, must be looked at and must be drilled down. And I am of the view that we have to have this conversation in a broader perspective rather than narrowing it down to, yes, this is the chart, this is what is happening. But I think if we are not people-centered, if we are not looking at the effect of what is happening in terms of the policies, all right, we will find ourselves in a particular situation. Now, I do not want to get into the argument, because the IMF in a report, which I can pull here, would have expressed a view that, listen, here what is happening. Our rates is undervalued. But that has implications. And I know Dr. Hossain and my friend, Dr. Trevor Farrell, they will deal with it. But I can only look at it from a perspective of the realities that is happening in Trinidad and Tobago. How do we then move forward? Because I want to be solution-oriented. Is it a fact that our education system has something to do with what is happening? Or how does the education system tie into crime? How does crime tie into the question of drugs and the guns that is on the streets? And how does that affect Trinidad and Tobago in terms of foreign investment which is a critical ingredient. Because with the greatest respect to everybody, I don't think that our economy can exist in the context of the present structure of the economy. We talk about diversification, and that is a bad word for some politicians. And I would have heard expressions about they talking about diversification. But can we as a society, can we as a people continue to place all our eggs in one basket and not expect to get the same results? Can we? Is diversification something that is required in Trinidad and Tobago? And we are saying within the labor movement, yes, it is required. But the question is, do we have the political will? Do we in these kinds of conversation just have a conversation, but we do not do what is necessary to make the changes that is important for Trinidad and Tobago to move forward? How do we, in the context, we could talk about foreign exchange, but how do we juxtapose that and intertwine that in the context of how many children who are the future of Trinidad and Tobago, who are leaving school and cannot read and write properly and do not have the cognitive skills that is required to take us to another level? The question is, therefore, from the labor movement, what kind of society that we want to build? What kind of education system that we want? Do we just want jobs that is low-wage jobs? Do we marginalize the middle class that is being done, and that is our construct from our own evidence and our research that we are doing? Or do we want to develop a society? Because, brothers and sisters, the listening public, when someone says in a leadership position that the rich has to get richer for the poor to get money, well, we know that we're in a dire strait. And therefore, I would want to end by making some observations, comrades. Money is what settles everything. Everything that you talk about. And then, therefore, the Forex has to be seen in the context that is money. And if we do not have what I will want to call the disposable income across the board, we will find ourselves in the particular situation that we are in. If we cannot have a say in the context of how money is spent on whole institutions and politicians and government accountable, and let them begin to understand that you are working for us, we're going to be here talking about these same problems over and over and over and over. And that is my deepest concern. And I will want to say the question of when you have income and productivity and you don't have that balance, or when you have profits running away from income.
Mr. Anisette, you have 2 minutes, please.
All right,
Thank you.
all right. I will wrap up. It places your economy in a burdensome situation where inevitably the people generally, all right, at the lower rung of the ladders, continues to suffer and will continue to suffer. And therefore, I will want to suggest that the question of wage-led growth and job-led growth is one of the answers for this particular situation. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anisette. Mr. Anisette raised some very important points. I do believe that when we look at many aspects of the public service that are owed money. When we look at the police, for example, and this ongoing issue right now about the concern about whether they work over Carnival and so on, I do believe people should be paid what they are due, and they should be paid what they are owed. When it comes to business across Trinidad and Tobago, the fact of the matter is consumers or people's disposable income will often determine the revenues earned by those businesses. And over the years, particularly, last year, Christmas and so on, I do believe that, speaking from my perspective, many of the small and medium businesses didn't do as well as they could have. One of those things that we felt was the reason was that people's living costs have kind of, taken a large bite out of what their disposable income was. So when they look at running a household, when they look at the additional costs, not necessarily food costs and so on. I mean, Dr. Farrell had spoken about inflation to some extent and so on. But when we look at some of the things that are in place, particularly the oncoming property tax for some, the fact that utility costs may rise, electricity, water and so on, it will take its toll and it will take its effect. But the question is, how does the private sector pay more in an environment where commercial activity is not increasing and there is less economic growth than we really want there to be? As a matter of fact, there's not enough growth in business. I would think new businesses and so on, and growth in the economy and expansion within the economy across the board, for us to be able to all have a win-win scenario going forward. But nonetheless, thank you, Mr. Anistet, for raising the things that you have. Right now, I'd like to introduce Professor Roger Hussain. Dr. Roger Hussain is he's no stranger to these forums. As a matter of fact, he has been for a very long time speaking to many of the chambers for years now. He's also always made himself available to the business community. He also works in a consultative role within the Caribbean, most notably recently in Guyana and so on. He's also published, and in his own time, he actually works very actively in charity and so on. He's a man who's quite selfless, gives of his knowledge and so on, I believe, because I've known him for a long time, for the betterment of all. Dr. Roger Hussain.
Thank you very much for that. Are you all seeing my screen?
Hi, Prof. No, not yet.
Okay, so in the interest of time, it's 20 past 8. I would quickly go to slide 2. This graph came from the Energy Chamber. I believe it was presented on Monday at the Energy Chamber by NGC. I just wanted Terence, if he is still on, to note that I worked out the numbers, Terence, and 2010, this was 4,400 MMCF per day. And by 2027, what the NGC is basically suggesting is that by 2027, we should be at about, well, the numbers I got was about 2,000 MMCF per day. So that, to me, is startling, as you could see here, and I know Dr. Gookool would elaborate on this. We have the IMF in each iteration of their World Economic Outlook. They have downgraded the good performance of the Trinidad and Tobago economy. So whereas in 2015, when compared to 2015, Whereas if we use the IMF October 2021 document, we were 13% smaller than in 2015. When you use the IMF October 2023 document, we are almost 20% smaller than in 2015. So that stands out as a serious matter we need to look at. And because of this relationship here between gas production and real GDP, you could see with the forecasted number that both Terrance and NGC provided, you could see that as gas production fall, the real GDP growth, the outcome is expected to be much lower and even negative. Just in terms of the really effective exchange rate that Terrance mentioned, what you find if you compare the IMF 2022 data and the IMF 2023 data, because of the rise in prices in Trinidad and Tobago relative to our main trading partners, and in this case in particular the USA, our economy has the exchange rate has become significantly more appreciated than we thought. And that's a big part of the problem that we face in terms of fetching more foreign exchange in terms of the non-energy sector. And here I show that as I saw Terrance produce a very interesting graph on the non-tradable sector in the context of the Dutch disease. Here I show that as the non-tradable sector employment, as a percent of total employment increases, which it is doing, it's now about 88%. External debt increases, and that's for a variety of reasons linked to fetching foreign exchange and also increase in imports. And here I show that the non-tradable sector, real output per worker in the non-tradable sector has fallen over time, whilst the employment share has increased. I show the relationship between natural gas production and various macroeconomic indicators, and the urgency of the need to switch to green hydrogen, which are alternative forms of energy. And in the last two slides, I speak about the need to boost tourism as a mechanism to help boost foreign exchange, and the need to boost remittances as the avenue to boost foreign exchange, all this alongside boosting non-energy exports. So those are three areas in which we could make some headway. Someone asked, I think it was Adam Raphael, who asked about the scope for non-energy exports. Fortunately, our manufacturing production has been rising. And if that continues and we continue to spill over natural gas production into the foreign exchange market via exports, then that would be a worthy outcome for the economy. So in the interest of time, I would just stop there, and I would make my slideshow available to anyone who wants and turn over back to Vivek Shah.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to introduce our last speaker for the evening, Dr. Rebecca Gookool-Bosland. She's an economist working on improving developmental outcomes in the Southwest Peninsula, a lecturer at the Department of Economics and associate coordinator of the Trade and Economic Development Unit at University of the West Indies. And the premise of her current work is localized economic development. I'd also like to say that Dr. Rebecca Gookool-Bosland, she's been, very quietly behind the scenes, an instrumental part of many of these talks that have been ongoing. She's always been there, very supportive, and doing a lot of the supporting work in the background. In her free time, she actually works a lot in charity. She has a great appreciation of, what is really happening on the ground in Trinidad and Tobago, and not just an intellectual capacity. She actually sees and understands much of what is happening in our country, particularly with our underprivileged and so on. I'd like to introduce Dr. Rebecca Gookool-Bosland.
Hi, Vivek, and to everyone, good night. Just like Dr. Hussein, I want to move quickly in the interest of time. Just one little correction. I am a former member of staff at the UWI. I currently work in the private sector, also in the area of development. So let's go. Quickly, I'm going to talk tonight about the impact of foreign exchange access and falling foreign exchange access on micro and small firms. Specifically, I'm going to highlight it in terms of our market segmentation, direct and indirect impacts, short and medium term outlook, and really some suggestions in terms of how do we consider pivoting for survival of these types of micro firms. So in 2021, the Ministry of Labor and Small and Medium Enterprise identified that of the existing 25,000 registered small businesses, that 93% of those businesses were in the services sector. Now, given the definitions that the ministry would have used, that is being registered, those applied definitions take up categories 2, which is a self-employed person or a self-employed person as a matter of an entrepreneurial lifestyle. This particular graph segments the small and medium-sized market into separate cadres of entrepreneurial activity. The one I want to focus on is the first one, especially because in an environment where you have declining economic outcomes, this survival type entrepreneurship, which is what is often defined as necessity type entrepreneurship, increases. Now, what are we talking about when we say necessity type entrepreneurs? These are people who look at starting a business because of push factors and a last ditch for economic survival. Single parent households and immigrants will generally fall into this group. Generally, they are low skilled, unemployable, and really include persons such as taxi drivers or maxi drivers, generally operates in the informal sector or unregistered businesses. They are and would include small operations like garages where the skills is basically learning by doing, solo operators, or there are business units that are generally small family units, small shops or suitcase traders. These businesses have limited scope for growth, corner shops, and concentrated in services, as with many of the small businesses, especially because services industries have a low barriers to entry and exit. And that particular characteristic makes it transient, but nonetheless, it is important for us to take note of. So those are like vendors and, as I said, corner shops, etc. This sector is also generally unprotected by national insurance schemes, and even if the individual themselves are employed, what you find is that they're employed in lower skill jobs, a security officer, etc. But you would also see these types of people push for and engage in the side hustle, any other activity that generates income to maintain their household. So we've been talking about in various ways what is the likely impact of this crisis that we're calling a foreign exchange crisis, which according to Dr. Farrell is not quite a crisis, but really shows up in the mechanisms of distribution. So you have one group benefiting as opposed another. These headlines, and I wanted to make it clear to us that this particular conversation on the distribution mechanism of foreign exchange has been happening for a little while. These dates show that, I mean, as far back as 2012, 2015, in the national media, we've been seeing concerns being raised regarding foreign exchange access. In December 2023, The Guardian reported that foreign exchange shortage challenges all sectors, but undoubtedly the smaller companies or micro businesses or even the necessity entrepreneurs are likely to be more economically vulnerable since they do not have access to the same opportunities for access as medium and larger companies. In September 2023, the Newsday noted that SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, but of course that would include some of the vulnerable micro enterprises importing goods, either juggle credit cards, resort to black market US sources, or just fold up the shop. The Daily Express in March of 2023, quoting the current governor of the central bank, indicated that he said citizens will have to be prepared to continue facing shortages for foreign exchange for some time to come. This situation will persist until as a country we can achieve market equilibrium based on improved macroeconomic conditions. It relates to that some of the indications and implications raised by Dr. Farrell before. The market clearing mechanism that maps demand against supply isn't working as well as we expect. So this cadre of entrepreneurs, the necessity entrepreneurs, they do have some direct and indirect impacts as a result of this poorer access to foreign exchange, in terms of less access to the dollar, the actual physical fiat currency that Dr. Farrell talked about at the commercial banks, also lower credit limits. But what really licks up, quote unquote, this cadre of entrepreneurs is the compounding indirect effect that this foreign exchange access situation has on the wider economy. Higher import fees, challenges with supply, higher prices on merchandise goods used as imports. And as I highlighted earlier, the majority of these entrepreneurs are concentrated in the services sector, which of course, and as we know by construct, services sector heavily depend on imported goods and services. There's also likely to be increased competition, and we saw this happen over the period of COVID, where the Internet of Things and the Facebook marketplace blew up with this type of virtual business where everyone and their mother got involved in importing, making consumer goods available to the public. And the final compounded impact that we do see is the multiplier effect on all prices in the economy, not just impacting on the micro entrepreneur, but of course everyone else. But when the micro entrepreneur has to engage an income earning or an income generating activity, this multiplier effect, of course, will have a negative impact on their costs. I would have shown here and included several price indices for many of the sectors that are inputs into micro businesses and even small business costs. So on the panel at the top, we see food, rent, transportation, and retail prices in general, all of which have been increasing since January 2020 to November 2023. On the lower panel, household furniture and equipment, household, hotels, cafes and restaurants, recreation and culture, and miscellaneous goods and services. All of these indices show an upward trend. And mind you, these indices represent inputs into micro and small businesses in general. Now, this is a graph that Dr. Hussein just showed. And basically, it is showing continuous revisions of our real growth trajectory over the period 2015 to 2022. He highlighted in particular that in 2022, the economy using the latest revision of growth data was 19.8% smaller than in 2015 and 8.8 smaller than in 2019. This declining growth trajectory and the magnitude of this declining growth is of course coinciding with declining quality of our macroeconomic environment. Unemployment is rising, underemployment is rising. There's a falling labor force participation rate, worsening ease of doing business, fewer opportunities for employment, youth unemployment, crime and reduced citizen security, and weakened economic linkages between sectors. The truth is the average man on the street is feeling the decline. He may not know exactly how to interpret numbers like this, but as Vivek said earlier, it is showing up in lesser sales. For him, the average doubles man is now selling less. He now has to come out more often. He is now faced with the threat of someone coming to rob him on the spot. And the narrative that is being touted is that things are getting better. The truth is these numbers show otherwise. One might even say, okay, even if I'm not interpreting these numbers correctly, let's see what the future looks like. This particular growth, also courtesy of Professor Hussein, shows that even for the medium-term period, there is some strange writing on the wall that we cannot afford to neglect. There is going to be some negative economic impacts and shocks that are specific to the TNT economy. And we've compared TNT economy here with several other economies that are of similar size. In the medium-term period, notice the growth rate of these economies as compared to ours. So definitely we need to be able to generate and spark the economic dynamic on the ground. So just focusing quickly on some of the suggestions for the necessity entrepreneurs. And these suggestions come from a place of current economic thought surrounding the donut economy model, which is that if we focus on the most vulnerable, then the mechanisms and the spillover impact that will have is that it will strengthen the economy as a whole and generate positive impacts. So at the individual level, these individual necessity entrepreneurs deepen the skills, focus on the crafts, plumbing, carpentry, and move away from the buy and sell operations. And of course, that would speak to some of the points raised by Dr. Farrell in that whether or not we consider the environment incentivizing retail and sale, but it augurs well in an environment where access to foreign currency for the purposes of imports, what we would need to do is focus on those skills that can be sold: carpentry, plumbing, tiling, those tech box skills. Leverage remittances where they exist for income generating outcomes, and practice Spanglish. At the end of the day, we are in an economy where the immigrants are assimilating into the society at the rung of micro businesses, so that leveraging this opportunity, whether as a source of potential labor or even considering it as potential competitors, there is a benefit to becoming more conversant with the, not quite the Spanish, but the Spanglish, the getting around in the neighborhood type of situation. At the community level, there is a need for smaller and medium size and other types of firms to get involved via their CSR interventions to focus on small and micro suppliers. Business chambers can and should be used as hubs for incubators focusing on perhaps a basic set of services that micro businesses may need, whether it is advertising, whether it is whatever it is. These business incubators are important, and it can generate some type of entrepreneurial dynamic at the grassroots level. Of course, there is a role for the state, boost investment in operations like NEDCO, small business training, promote buy local, and that way we complement interventions that build local capacity with improving the demand for the output of local capacity. Use a top-down approach alongside the bottoms-up approach, which is focus on localized economic development at the regional corporation level, improve the ease of doing business, stimulate sectors which generate rather than consume foreign exchange. Again, it comes down to incentivizing, but there is now a great need to be able to do that. Identify pilot projects based on clusters, and the going state suggestion and intervention and even demand at this stage is to improve the citizen security situation. So with that, Vivek, I'm going to hand over to you, and I would be happy to leverage questions when and if they arise.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. At this point in time, the presentations are at an end, and I'd like to invite any questions to any one of the speakers. You can post it on the chat, and I will read it out if necessary. So now I'd like to invite you to the viewers for questions. I see your hand up, sir, Professor Gonzalez. On mic, please, Professor Gonzalez.
Dr. Gonzalez, you have to unmute your mic. Dr. Gonzalez, we're still not hearing you. No, we're not hearing you properly.
Take another question, please, now you'll come back on, I think.
All right. Any other questions?
Let me ask Terence a question as we have him on. So
Okay.
Terence, just to verify with you, right, that when we borrow, these money go to form part of the stock of reserves at the central bank. That is correct?
If the loan is in excess of a year, in other words, if you borrow short term for less than a year, then it will not count in the reserves. If you borrow for a period that is longer than a year, then yes, it's counted in the reserves. But you're quite right. In my presentation, which I lost, I had an external debt graph. So external debt has doubled between 2015 and 2023. So the point is that as we are going forward, we have that increased debt service that we have to worry about. Interest rates have gone up, as we know, in the last couple of years, which has increased the cost of borrowing and therefore increased debt service. The expectation is that the Fed is going to start to bring interest rates down in 2024, maybe from the middle of 2024. But I don't think, quite frankly, that it is likely that we are going to get interest rates back down to the levels where they were, say, during the period post-financial crisis. Yeah, our debt servicing costs are going to be higher than they were before.
And we have a question from Ryan Sitaran.
Vivek, if I could just add something to what Terence said. All I would add to that is that we saw these we saw these increases in external debt from 2015 to 2023. And in
Yeah.
fact, if you look from 2010 to 2023, from 2010 to 2015, it was softer, but from 2015 to 2023, it was sharper.
Yes.
And even so, in the context of that relatively sharp increase in external debt, real GDP growth today, as compared to the same 2015, is, if I remember the correct numbers correctly, maybe about 18% less. So that's what has me a little concerned, but we live a day.
But may I ask a question on the heels of what you Roger, you and Terence were discussing, which is from the layman's perspective, when the government borrows, or let's say the size of our external debt, when the government borrows internationally, it has to be paid back, obviously. And the monies from which it has to be paid back comes from when? Does it come from the government's revenues that they earn directly? Does it come from, is it the central bank that pays it back? How does the government go about repaying the loans that it takes, the foreign debt that it incurs?
It is paid back through the central bank. So in the same way that foreign exchange flows to the government come through the central bank, and the central bank credits the government with the TT dollar equivalent, when the government has to repay that, it is paid back through the central bank. So that's basically that's how the mechanism works.
So then therefore, Terence, so then the size of the foreign debt would obviously have a bearing on how much, how much the FOREX, the government can then sell to the commercial banks and so on from the central bank, correct?
No. Because so they sell that as it's a stock, all right? It's like,
Okay.
like the water you have in your water tank. What the central bank is doing has to do with the flows, right, on a monthly or an annual basis into the commercial banking system. Now, obviously, when you borrow more and interest rates go up, your debt servicing increases, right? So the amount of money that we pay in interest and then repayment of principal in the future is going to be higher, and that comes out of the foreign exchange reserves. Now, the Ministry of Finance, together with the central bank, there's a debt management unit in the Ministry of Finance, which essentially does projections of our debt servicing costs way out 5 years, 10 years down the road, so that at any point in time, the central bank and the Ministry of Finance know what the debt servicing obligations of the country are relative to the amount of foreign exchange reserves that we have.
Thanks. Ryan Seacharan asked, good night, excellent presentation. Can you remind me of the reserves of FOREX in the country, Heritage Stabilization Fund, and IMF?
At the IMF, not the IMF. Sorry, a good point on the IMF. I forgot to mention that. As you see in the chart that I had, one of the little bump ups that we had, I think it was in 2021, was due to the fact that the IMF gave everybody, all IMF members, got an increase in their SDR holdings. So Trinidad and Tobago got an increase in our foreign exchange reserves of about $600 million equivalent as a result of that, by doing nothing. Okay, so if you look at the central bank data, you'll see this big bump up in our foreign exchange reserves, which is due to the fact that the IMF did this global allocation of SDRs to everybody. All countries got based in proportion to their quotas. So our foreign exchange, if you want to know the distribution of the foreign exchange reserves, the IMF holdings, IMF reserve tranche and SDR holdings are part of the foreign exchange reserve, but they're a relatively small part. Most of the foreign exchange reserves are invested by the central bank, basically in fixed income securities held, so the government treasuries, US government treasuries, there might be a little bit of sterling and so on. The HSF is a little bit different. The HSF, the managers of the HSF, part of the HSF is in fact invested in equities, and some of it is invested in fixed income. And that's one of the reasons why in last year, when the stock market dropped, both fixed income and equities dropped at the same time, which is actually quite unusual. And that led to a significant drop in the stock of the HSF, but that has since rebounded, and the HSF stock of reserves has in fact increased in the last year.
Before we go on to Dr. Gonzalez, Clifton Simpson has a question to the panel. There's an ongoing issue between the state and trade unions on the 4% offer. How do you see that affecting the economy when it comes to spending power and the ability to purchase goods and services, in particular on the ability of the manufacturing industries to purchase raw materials for new products?
That's Mr. Andy, is it?
I assume yes.
All right, I thought that my learned friends would have taken a bite of it, but seeing that they tried at the trade union movement, but it's a point that we have been making within the trade union movement from our experiences. The question of the issue that I would have raised, which was growth-led growth and also wage-led growth, is fundamental to any economy. And that was a study that was done by the International Labour Organization, for which we are part of. And what has come out from that study, that an economy can only grow when there is a job-led growth and a wage-led growth. And the issue of percentage wage increases must have some kind of correlation to the question of your purchasing power and maintaining your purchasing power, one, and the question of another issue where we do not see it being measured in Trinidad and Tobago. What is your purchasing power in terms of time on your job? In other words, how many hours you may have to work to buy a bread or to buy a pound of sugar. And those are critical areas. And the final one is the time value of our money. And we will continue to make the point. You cannot give me a wage increase in 2023 at Christmas time for a period that started from 2012. We see it as a deliberate, indirect measures to downgrade wages indirectly under the disguise that we are not doing any IMF program, but in effect, it is a form of austerity measures that interferes with the economy. And I will end by saying that I always say, my purchase of goods and services is an ability to pay other people within the economy. And therefore, those proposals does not have any reality in the context of what is happening on ground zero.
But Chairman, if I could just offer a slightly different interpretation
Sure.
to my friend Zainzet. So the way I look at it is this, right? And so the Minister of Finance has offered all the public sector people 4%. And he's done that in a really very interesting way, because what he said to the trade union movement is that if you don't accept the 4%, this matter goes to the special tribunal. And the special tribunal, whatever they give you, you will end up with an agreement that is going to last 2 triennials, okay? And that has caused all the trade unions to cave in. Everybody caved in and took the 4%. Now, the question is, why is the Minister of Finance so insistent on the 4%? And we're expecting to go back to 2010 or 2012 and so on. We have this bad habit in this country of doing these wage increases on a lagged basis. And it causes the trade union movement and the workers no end of grief, right? It's a very, very bad system that we have. Because by the time workers get any increase, whether it's 4% or 20%, right, the circumstances, the economic circumstances may have changed. They have gotten worse. Going back to 1981, 82, the public sector workers got wage increases of 120% in 1981, 1982, precisely at the time when oil prices dropped and caused the government to go into a fiscal deficit, simply because we don't deal with wage increases on a contemporaneous basis. We have this very bad system of dealing with giving wage increases based on previous triennial going back 4, 5, 6 years. But the basic problem that the Minister of Finance is really treating with, he doesn't say so, but what he's treating with is the fact that government revenues are down. The government runs what basically we can call a wages fund type system. It has a pot of money, and what it wants to do is that it wants to maximize employment. It wants to maximize the number of people in jobs, but it has a fixed amount of money, right? And that amount of money is in fact declining. The demands on the government budget are increasing all the time. There are fixed demands that you have for pensions, for public servants, previous people who have retired. That's one of the first claims on the government budget. And their fixed costs, external debt is going up. So it means that the pot of money that the Minister of Finance has to deal with current wages and salaries is in fact declining. So in those circumstances where the government wants to maximize people who are employed, the only option it has is to either cut wages or keep wages down, keep wage rates down. And that's exactly what the Minister of Finance is doing. And that's the explanation, Mr. Anizet, why I think that he has offered the 4%, which is like offering nothing in effect. In real terms, the Minister of Finance has offered zero. When you take into account inflation, he has offered nothing. And the reason for that is because I'm saying the government simply cannot afford it. The other option for the government would be, in fact, to reduce public sector employment, to send people home. And the government has elected not to do that for political reasons. So that's I think, an alternative explanation for what we are seeing with the 4%.
Speaking about that, does anyone remember when in Barbados they started to offer visa packages to people in the public service? It was many years ago, I believe. I don't know if I'm mistaken in that. It's quite interesting.
But may I respond so it can have some clarity on what my learned friend Dr. Farrell said?
Of course, of course.
All right. First, it's not all the trade unions cave in. That's the first point that I want. It was from the police, the army, okay, amalgamated workers accepted it, the teachers accepted it. Having said that, I want you to understand that within the same bargaining period, the private sector as the private sector would have been able to sit down and do the very same contemporaneous negotiations that you are talking about. And we were able, and the records are there to show within that period, we would have gotten a minimum of 9 percentage points based on the contracts that have been registered in the industrial court. And the question is, do you want to say, well, keep our workers, but don't pay them? That is what we are saying. Or does an employer and the government must be treated as an employer? Does the employer has a responsibility under the ILO and the question of the right to collective bargaining to ensure that collective agreements are negotiated at the correct time? And it's not that proposal was not sent in by the unions for those collective periods, and the government failed to come around the table, the negotiating table. As I speak to you, are you aware that there are some state and statutory boards that have not received any proposals from the government yet to engage in negotiations on behalf of those groups of workers? And finally, there are two bodies. One is before the court and the next one is going in a while. The NIB, who would have negotiated a 9% wage increase, which the board signed off. And the Minister of Finance refused, contrary to the NIB Act, to accede to that request. Additionally, on the port, there was a sign-off on agreement for 12%. And let me point out, the NIB and also the Port Authority are not dependent on the coffers of the government of Trinidad and Tobago to pay their wages. And the question is now why it is in those circumstances that the government is insisting that they do not want to pay the 9% and the 12% respectively. Those are the questions that we have to ask. We are living in Trinidad and Tobago, and as workers, we have a right to be able to maintain a standard of living that would not send us into abject poverty and wage deprivation.
On that note, Mr. Anisette, thank you. We have one last we want to wrap up now. Is 9. We have Dr. Gonzalez, who I will allow to have the last question. Roger, there's also Mr. Ramkisoon, I believe. Ronald Ramkisoon is saying, Roger, the HSF figure needs to be corrected. If you can respond to him on the chat, Roger, while Dr. Gonzalez has a say. Dr. Gonzalez.
Dr.
Dr.
Gonzalez, we're
Gonzalez?
still not hearing you.
No, I think he's waiting.
Can I use Trudy Gonzalez's time to ask Dr. Farrell a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Terry, good night. Can you indicate a bit as to the likely effect of that particular way of managing the foreign exchange reserves, the effect of that on economic growth?
Well, so it's two things. One is, as I mentioned, the fact that we're maintaining a fixed nominal exchange rate, and therefore we have real exchange rate appreciation, which leads to all of the effects, the disincentivization of exports and so on. So that's the one thing. The other thing has to do with the rationing effect. The rationing effect then has a distributional effect. So as I said, and I was being a little bit euphemistic, the amount of foreign exchange that you get depends on your relationship that you have with your commercial bank. Some people have suggested that therefore the bigger players will get more foreign exchange, but that is always going to be the case. The bigger companies are the ones who are bringing in more goods and so on that everybody buys. Okay, so everybody goes to Massey, everybody goes to PriceMart, everybody, and therefore those companies actually get more foreign exchange than the small guys who will be importing less stuff. So I think that the problem there is the distributional effect that one has to worry about, and whether or not then that maldistribution of foreign exchange then does have certain other kinds of knock-on consequences. So, for example, one businessman told me the other day, he said, look, I am struggling to get foreign exchange, and so therefore what I do is that I price my foreign exchange at X dollars, right? I don't use 679, I don't use 680, I use another rate, right? And therefore what that does is that means that the cost of the goods and services that he is providing to the rest of us and so on then goes up by that amount. So yeah, you do have some of those kinds of effects inside of there. Whether it has a long-term effect on economic growth and so on, that's a moot question. And as I'm there, and I know we're out of time, I'll just make the point about the credit card situation, which somebody mentioned. The reason why the commercial banks had to cut back on the credit cards is because, as I said, the commercial banks manage their what they call their oversold position. Okay, which is to say that people come into them and they want foreign exchange, and they would actually sell them foreign exchange that they don't yet have. Okay, so the commercial bank is in an oversold position. Now, they will do that because they anticipate that they will be getting inflows from the central bank at some point in time. If those flows from the central bank do not materialize or don't materialize to the same amount, then the commercial bank has a bit of a problem. Now, the commercial bank cannot effectively project or predict what those credit card flows are going to be. They just simply don't know. People have a credit card and they have a limit, and they could use the entire amount of credit cards, or they could use none. So therefore, in a situation where people demand for foreign exchange is high and they use their credit cards to the max and pay them down, the commercial banks might then find themselves in a very difficult situation, which is what I think in fact happened, which caused at least one bank that we know to reduce the credit card limit so it could better manage its foreign exchange position. And I hope that helps the understanding of the problem.
It does. So are there any other further questions? Dr. Gonzalez was next. Dr. Gonzalez. Well, I do believe we've run out of time, unfortunately. I'd like to thank our panelists this evening. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us this evening. I'd also like to thank the listeners. We had quite a few come on, up to 60-something people came on this evening. Thank you all for spending time to listen this evening. And I wish everybody a very good night. Thank you.
Okay, good night, everyone.